Welcome everyone to the 2020 Biopharma Market Trends and Investment Insights with Real World Perspectives. I'm Donna Lavoie, President and CEO of Lavoie Health Science, a leading strategic communications firm focused in helping health and science innovators around the globe. I'm really excited to be here today with the Biotechnology Innovation Association to talk about the 2020 market trends, which many of you know are unprecedented. We will have a formal presentation with insights and Q&A from our distinguished panelists. We thank you for joining today. We realize that in this virtual world, there's a lot of places to spend your time, so we thank everyone for joining. We also want to remind everyone that the BioInvestor Forum is scheduled for October 13th to 15th virtually, and we'd love to see you signed up if you haven't already. Now let's talk about the panelists that we have today, and I'll start with Marcy Graham, who is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Poseida Therapeutics. Poseida is a clinical stage cell and gene therapy company and is in the class of 2020 IPOs. Poseida has raised almost $500 million since 2018. Marcy has 15 years of specialized experience in both biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies with an emphasis on fundraising and investor relations, contributing more than $4 billion in capital since joining the industry. She was previously head of communications at Mirati and is at Biopharma, taking the latter public with an IPO in 2015. She also led comms at Ambit Biosciences, where she directed communication strategy around the company's IPO and eventual acquisition by Daiichi Sankyo. Secondly, we have Stacy Seltzer, who is a partner at Aisling and has been a partner or working at Aisling since 2008. And so Stacy has seen a lot of trends over the years during her time at Aisling. Previously to Aisling, she was involved in a lot of deal making from a business development function, marketing and sales at Schering-Plough. Stacy is currently a director of Immune Therapeutics in Miramar Labs. Previously, she served as a board observer at Agile Therapeutics, Dorada Therapeutics, Zeltic, and Aesthetics. And she also acted as the Aisling representative for its investment in precision dermatology and was closely involved in Aisling's investments in Cytos, Dermira, and Power Vision. Lastly, but not leastly, we have David Thomas, CFA, and many of you know David from his yearly bio investment trends reports that he does at the Bio and International Conference and beyond. David is the VP of Industry Research at Bio, covering investment, R&D, and alliance deal trends, as well as regulatory statistics that impact policy initiatives in Washington. Prior to Bio, David spent time as a biochemist in drug discovery at Amgen, Millennium, Novartis, and the J. Craig Venter Institute. David today will set the stage and provide us with the state of emerging company trends in 3 key areas. First, he's going to take us through the public funding environment in 2020, which will take about 10 minutes. Then we will do the venture funding to date, which will also be about 10 minutes. And we will wrap up with M&A and licensing for the last 5. At each of the sections, we will open up for Q&A. We will have a formal Q&A from questions that I've developed. And then you'll also notice that you have a little chat box. And so we'll try to take as many questions as we can from the chat box. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to David to begin and walk us through the data. Go ahead, David.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Donna. So as Donna mentioned, we have 3 sections here. So first, it will be the IPOs and the follow-on offerings, and then we'll take a break and we'll have a little bit of Q&A before we're heading on into the venture capital. And I just want to point out here the data that we compile. I'll be talking about the databases we use, but it's really our team, Chad Wessel and myself, that go through and put this data together. So we have compiled all of our data after this webinar on our bio.org/IA reports homepage. So for previous reports, you can download the PDFs that are on the screen here, previous trend reports, clinical trial success reports, deep dives into indications. But this year we also launched, at the bottom there, you can see the links to our interactive trends report. So instead of a PDF, it's now an interactive Tableau for all the stuff I'm going to talk about today. But also this year, we've been working on a COVID-19 pipeline tracker, which we update every Monday. So if you're interested in looking at the vaccines or antivirals treatments, take a look at that website there. So first up, the data from public financings, we use data directly from NASDAQ for follow-ons, primarily BioCentury, and also FactSet for company information. So as background, I'm going to show you some 10-year charts. So it's good to have the context of the market cap weighted index, the MBI, for where we've been over the last 10 years. 370% increase in the first half of the decade with a peak in 2015. And really it's been about getting back to that 2015 level for the last 5 years. So net, we're about up 1% in 5 years at about the 4,200 level. So that gives you some context for what's happened since that big drop there in 2015, 2016, where the pricing issues were front and center politically. So here is a look at the 10 years into the end of 2019. And what you see here on the left are the number of US IPOs, with the peak actually being in 2014 for US IPOs, not 2015. You also see an increase in preclinical and phase 1 IPOs, something that we're seeing more of, and the previous peak was 2018 for those very early stage IPOs. On the dollar side, funds raised 2018 was actually the peak at a little over $5 billion raised. So where we're at right now in 2020, we have 42 US IPOs. So we're already above the full year 2019. And it's likely we could be in that number 2 for the decade. In terms of dollars raised this year, at $7.3 billion. So that is an all-time record, and we're only 3/4 of the way through 2020. So billions more than that peak in 2018. In terms of other trends, if we look at the top 15 IPOs this year, what I've done in a lot of these tables is highlight the oncology companies, because you're going to see that as a running theme here. Also, the rare disease companies are pointed out, and then potentially the COVID pipeline, if companies are working within COVID itself, just to point that out and discuss it. But the other thing you notice in these IPOs is the number of preclinical companies going public. So this is something that we've seen a little bit of an increase in the last 2 years, but this year is going to be a record for companies exiting at the preclinical stage. You also notice that in the top 15, they're all over $200 million raised. So that really hasn't happened in the past. This is pushing the average raised up to 175 million. That's way above where a lot of banks shoot for that $85 million round that we've seen historically. So it's been a great year, and some of these companies, very young, sporting market caps of $1 billion or more. Outside the United States, this is the 10-year plot for the IPOs. 2015 was the peak in ex-US IPOs with 41. And the dollars peaked again in 2018. Right now, we're at 19 IPOs. So we're likely to be in that range, 2016, 2018, for the end of the year. And in terms of dollars, we already are at a record for dollars raised for IPOs. You don't see as much activity on the preclinical side recently, or even in phase one, it's a smaller percentage ex-US. The top 15 companies with IPOs are listed here outside the US. You don't see as many preclinical companies, but you see oncology being the major theme. And we have two examples for companies within the COVID space, in particular CureVac. They're now with a market cap of 8 billion. And I should point out Legend Biotech on the top, headquartered in New Jersey, but registered in the Cayman Islands, so it ends up on our ex-US list there at the top. But here you see 5 of the companies under that $200 million mark, but a total 19 companies. So this is the top 15 out of 19. There aren't as many smaller IPOs. So the average for IPOs outside the US is actually higher than in the US. Okay, now rolling on to the follow-on offerings. So the follow-on offerings, the chart looks a little bit different. We have a 2018 peak for United States companies able to raise over 10 million. So this is only counting companies that raise over 10 million in the public markets, predominantly phase 3 and phase 2 companies. So far, year to date, we have 112. So this will likely be the largest in terms of quantity of companies able to raise over $10 million in the history of biotech. On a dollars basis, we're at 16 billion. So we are already surpassing previous follow-on offerings from R&D stage companies. So I should mention that all this data is for R&D stage companies. It's specifically therapeutic companies, not diagnostics. So those are taken out, and market stage companies are taken out. And to finish off with the top 15 here for US, none of the companies in the top 15 are preclinical. You have half of them in oncology, a couple in working on the coronavirus, and Moderna being the outlier with 2 IPOs raising 1.8 billion and now at a $26 billion market cap. But primarily, the theme has been oncology and infectious disease for the follow-on offerings in that top tier. Ex-US, this is a plot on the same y-axis as you saw for the US follow-on offerings. So you can see it's substantially less. But things have really improved in the last few years for ex-US companies able to raise money on the exchanges. We are at 25 year to date, so this will likely be a record for companies raising outside the US, and then dollars that has also already hit a record with $4.2 billion raised. And the top 15 outside the US, you can see here, similar theme, not as many oncology companies actually. It's a little bit more diversified into rare disease. So oncology again, and rare disease being the predominant companies able to raise money, as well as a couple of COVID examples there. Okay, so I'll pause there and we can open it up for Q&A.
Great. So first question, Dave and Stacy, what is driving this momentum and demand? Is it just that we're all incredibly productive in our COVID home offices, and we all have so much time on our hands that, you know, what's really going on here? Because this is you know, fairly unusual.
So I guess from my perspective as an investor in both the private side and the public side, I think there's a lot more excitement right now about the biotech space in general, just because it's considered safer. I mean, with everything going on and the uncertainties in many different areas, I think investors in general view drug development as a more attractive area because it's not going away with everything that's going on with coronavirus. And so you're seeing a lot more activity, not only from the folks who normally invest in biotech companies, but also a lot of generalist investors.
Right. That's interesting. So when you say generalist, are you talking, Stacey, generalist funds, or are you also talking, real interest from retail ownership?
I focus more on at the fund level. I would defer to Dave about the retail side, but just I think investor sentiment, even in the lay person, understands that biotech has been almost helped by the coronavirus pandemic because folks are really focused on drug development. They're seeing progress. There's a lot of discussion. There are not a lot of layoffs, which you're hearing on in most other industries. So I think it can be clear even to the less sophisticated investor.
Dave, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I would say that it's definitely what Stacey has just mentioned about the difference between this sector versus other sectors. But I think there's a follow through as well with respect to what's been happening in the sector, and some people are just coming to realize, wow, look at what is happening on a scientific level. So one of the things we point out in a lot of the slides that you'll see, even in venture capital and deal making, is the extent to which oncology is represented in the larger deals, and even as a percent. And what's happening is that the science is moving at light speed, where we're having targets that weren't even around maybe 5 years ago are being identified, and at the same time you have the modalities, whether it's cell therapies or modified antibodies, CRISPR, et cetera, being able to go after these targets in a unique way. So that sets up a huge opportunity, and that has actually been panning out, as you'll see in some of the acquisitions and in some of the successful previous IPOs. There were companies that were working at that frontier, and so because we see more and more of that scientific progress and new companies coming out with new ideas about how to attack disease, there's more opportunity. And so that holds true also for the rare disease. So it's oncology and rare disease. There's a reason why they make up the bulk of the deals in a lot of these areas that we're following.
Right, got it. Marcy, as a seasoned pro with public companies and IPOs, how was the 2020 IPO process different than what you've experienced before? And how should listeners be thinking about how best to prepare their companies? What's your advice?
Well, obviously this year was a little bit different given that we were in the pandemic and people are working from home. I think when we did a Series D and then an IPO about a month following, and we did both of them just at the start of this pandemic process. So that, of course, would be the one big difference from my last IPO round, which was in 2015, and another high point in the market. I would say what was good about that is, you could speak to someone in Zurich, Boston, and San Francisco all within a 3-hour period, right? And so you didn't have the travel burden that is so exhausting on management teams, particularly. You also had a lot more time to speak with investors because we had the Series D, as well as some test the waters meetings, as well as the IPO. And because everyone was home and because everyone had a little bit more time, a deep story in early sciences like CAR-T or cell therapies, and in gene therapies, a little bit more complex story to tell. And so we had a little bit more time to really get into the meat of what it is that we do. I think also being a platform company was well received because we had so many different shots on goal that again, that was part of the story that added richness and depth. And I think having the extra time that was allowed from being able to just dial up on a call was beneficial to that as well. I think back in 2015, I would say I did something similar then, where we did a MES round and then a follow-on IPO. And back then, what was interesting is that the crossovers were much more active, and whereas the IPO was a little bit more challenging this time around. And again, it could have been COVID or the timing of what was taking place, but the Series D took a little bit longer than what I would historically have experienced, yet the IPO went extremely smoothly with hundreds of folks that came in on it that had expressed interest early, and we were able to get it done in just 4 days. So that's, again, something that was quite different about this year.
Wow. Stacy, can you tell us, in your role at Aisling, how many IPOs were you and your colleagues involved with in 2020? And how is it different for you as an investor in the pandemic year experience?
Sure. So I'm involved. We're involved in a couple different IPOs. One that just filed publicly recently, and it's different in that everything is virtual, which has both pros and cons. I think the pro is you get just as much information, and as Marcy mentioned, you can have a longer conversation. But the con is it's harder to get that feeling for what's going to happen because you don't have all those nonverbal cues in the same way as you'd have if you were in person. You don't really have those, banker conversations as people are walking out the door where you really got to get what's going on. It changes the flavor of the whole process. But it goes out to a much broader audience because when you're presenting on a platform, it's much easier to have 20 people attend as opposed to in a conference room. So you're going to a broader audience, but you have less feedback as to how well it's going. In my experience right now, as Marcy said, the public markets are going gangbusters. Everybody wants to invest in public companies, almost to the detriment to the private side. There have been a couple deals that have had genuine trouble gaining any traction that maybe a year or two ago would have been a slam dunk investment. And it's because all of the companies that do public and private are really focused on either mezzanine rounds that are immediately going to go public or public companies. And so it's actually had more of an impact in an odd way on the private markets because private companies are having a little more trouble getting an investment unless they're considering going public.
So do you think, we've always thought about relationships as being key in ensuring that, management teams, whether private or public or private leading up to public, that they really develop deep relationships with, the crossovers and the like. In this environment, do you think that the companies that have gone out were ones that had those relationships, or do you think it didn't matter in this case?
It does matter. I'd say what matters just as much or more is having a very strong existing investor base. A lot of the companies that have been very successful have either had their books fully covered or mostly covered. And it's very rare to see a company go public nowadays that doesn't have an existing investor base that would be willing to take most of the round in a downside scenario. So that provides a lot of protection and surety for these companies going public. That's a relative, I wouldn't say it's a new phenomenon, but in the past it was kind of like they wanted the book to be 25% covered or 30% covered. Now the goal is really 100% covered, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Marcy, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of the relationship side of the equation and the importance of that?
What Stacy said is entirely accurate. We went out with more than one time covered when we hit the IPO road, and again, it was anomalous. It's not something I'd ever seen before, and I've done a few IPOs. The catch-22 for companies is, to her point, investors on the public side wanted to see almost full coverage, if not better, on the book before even hitting the road. And in order to get that, you of course need some activity on the private side, which is something people were less eager to do, I think, this year than prior years. So you were like, well, we have to get some good public good crossover representation before we go public. Yet the private markets are sort of not getting the same focus that the public markets are. So it was a little bit of a catch-22 for organizations. We were fortunate in that we had some good, solid, well-known mutual funds come in on our mezz, and that really, of course, helped push our IPO forward and make it possible. But I could see where that would be an issue for some companies this year.
Sure. Dave, what do you feel is driving the thirst for predominantly oncology-focused companies going public in 2020? I guess it always has been oncology in terms of main interest, but why aren't we seeing more in the anti-infective space given the COVID environment and the incentives for research in that area?
Yeah, when we look at the COVID pipeline, we see the majority of the products are actually repurposed or redirected. So companies that were already working on immunology, for example, or anti-inflammatory specifically, or even immune stimulators, a lot of these were products that were in the clinical trials for other indications like ARDS, et cetera, and that was moved over quickly. So the companies that you see on the list that do pop up, there aren't that many, but they are the vaccine companies or antibody companies which are making a product de novo from the sequence being announced in January. So they're able to take their existing platform and move it quickly into COVID. That's very different from someone that would have to start a company from scratch to go after the secondary effects of the infection, whether it's treating the downstream effects on the heart or the inflammation process, the kidney, et cetera. So those companies have previously raised money, and some of them are public, some of them are private. A lot of them are the multinationals that are engaged, and so there are not as many of those in the data that we have for IPOs for new startups, and you'll also see that in the venture capital side as well. And with respect to oncology, that has always been about a third, whether you look at licensing or IPOs or any of these areas. Even if you go to a conference, it's about a third oncology.
Right.
In the last few years, that's bumped up to about 40% in some cases, because there have been so many breakthroughs, in particular the immuno-oncology space, and the fact that the cell therapies have really proven themselves. So that's opened up even more opportunity in the oncology space than before. And as I said, the science, whether lung cancer or breast cancer, these are becoming mutation defined, and so they're becoming not one disease, but tens or even in some cases 100 diseases.
Yeah, I think it was BioCentury reported, I think it was out today, that 7 cell and gene companies did IPOs in 2020, all with above range price from the cover. So I think, Dave, that you cover it more from a therapeutic category, but how about the cell and gene? Any commentary there? Or that you could add to?
In terms of the numbers, the companies that are able to raise the largest rounds are going to be the platform companies, and it's a little bit tricky for us when the way we define the platform companies. A lot of these are platform companies, but in our breakdown in our reports, once a company moves into the clinic and it's a defined indication, we'll tag them as oncology, et cetera. But a lot of those are indeed platform companies. I think Poseida being a really good example of what investors are looking for right now, because they have basically a little bit of each of what I said. They have the technology, oncology, they even have the potential for rare disease. It's a mix of all the above.
Great. That leads me to my next question to Marcy. Marcy, what was it about the Poseida story that resonated with investors? And how is this different than other biotechs that you've led communications for? We've all lived in a shift from being, very product focused. You got to have that one product to get over the goal line. Now we're talking platforms again. So what was it about the story? And you said it was complicated, but having, the time with investors was really critical.
Right. Well, the benefit of a platform technology, obviously, is that you are able to have many moving parts, many assets in the pipeline or in development. We've got CAR T in oncology, both autologous CAR T and allogeneic CAR T, and we've got some gene therapies in liver-directed disease. So, we've got a rich pipeline. It's one with a couple of assets in the clinic and then many that are still in development. And, again, the benefit of a platform is that you can spur additional ideas from that, which of course we're always eager to do. The downside to that is that it takes a while to tell that story, because you have the technology story itself, and then you have the product story. So, to Dave's point, when you do hit the clinic, there's a lot of attention, of course, turned to those clinical milestones for any given therapy that might be going, be dosing in patients. So to bring back the attention to, hey, yes, we do have this in the clinic. Yes, we do have this other product in the clinic, but look what's coming down the pipeline. We have additional INDs that will be filed in the coming year, and additional trials that will be developed, but also, preclinically, there's still some very exciting science. So that sort of bifurcates your audience. You have the clinically facing group that is looking specifically towards that pathway to commercialization, and then you have the group that is extremely interested in the high science and what can be done in gene therapies and genetic editing. And being able to balance that, I think, is sometimes a challenge. But again, the benefit of being able to call up investors at any time because they're trapped at home is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing how it progresses.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think, Dave, in the interest of time, we should probably jump right into the venture side.
All right, let's do that. So venture capital, our final data that we put out in our reports comes from 4 different databases. The 2020 data that I'm going to show you is going to come specifically from BioCentury. Typically, at the end of the year, we compile all the data from all the databases and put it together. But here we are for worldwide, looking at the 10 years ending December of last year. We went from under $5 billion, beyond triple that, 18 and $17 billion in the last 2 years globally. Where we are right now, using our numbers from BioCentury, is 18.2 billion. So with 1 quarter left, we could be at the $20 billion range for venture capital. So it looks like a record year, historic year for biotech. And again, this is therapeutic companies only. The breakdown between outside the US and US companies receiving this financing, it's 34% ex-US, and that's a difference as well, where it used to be 20 to 25% in the early part of the decade. That has increased. A lot of that increase comes from China, but not all of it, as I'll show. This year, it's almost identical to last year in terms of that distribution. For US companies, if we look at the first 3 quarters of this year versus 2019, the first 3 quarters, we actually see an increase in the number and in the dollars, and it's fairly substantial here. You can see billions more raised year to date when you look at both of these 2 years here. So 12.1 billion for the US. When we break that down and look at specific series, the different rounds, we don't see any gaps. We see it for US companies, whether you're A round, B round, they're all up in terms of number of deals being done, as well as the total dollar amount for all of those rounds. It is an increase, and quite a substantial increase even for the D rounds, the later stage rounds, potentially part of that anticipation of IPO for some of those companies that are going out that late in the venture rounds. In terms of the top companies, top 20 companies, again, some of these are labeled platforms. Some of them that have moved on are very specific in terms of their disease. You can see that pointed out here. The takeaway here, in the top 20, only 2 of them are A rounds. In previous years, we had seen more A rounds that were fairly substantial, well over 200 million. Here we have two examples there. Again, to point out that only 2 out of these 20 are in the COVID space, and the rest is oncology, platform, or rare disease. And you can find exceptions, but you really have to dig to find those exceptions outside of those particular areas. And in that top 20, you have all of them well above $100 million in terms of their financing. In terms of first time Series A rounds, the Series A, when you tally up the data, some of the rounds are in different years. So they could be A2 or A3 rounds, contingent distribution of that Series A. So this is the first time a company receives a Series A. This is our proxy for how many new companies are being started that have the capital to run solid IND studies or even phase 1 studies. And you can see here we had a ceiling, if you will, of 94 for quite some time. And in 2018, it went up to 115. And we thought, well, we're going to be above 100 from here on out. But 2019, that didn't happen. And right now in 2020, we're counting about 68. So we're likely to be under 100. And so what this is suggesting is that there is some type of a max amount that those early stage investors, at least for US companies, the early stage investors are going to commit to shots on goal for starting new companies in a given year. Turning to outside the US, this is the trend that we've been seeing. If you look at Asia versus Europe, Asia went from almost nothing to more than Europe, and almost all of that is because of China. In 2019, we saw it dip down, and we saw Europe actually go up in 2019. So far this year, Europe is up big. It's going to be an all-time, in terms of dollars, all-time financing. And Asia likely to be either in line with 2018 or potentially a little bit above. But I think a lot of the activity is, in terms of pushing those ex-US numbers up, is actually coming from Europe and not Asia this year. In terms of total financings right now, if you were to look at 2019, again, the first 3 quarters versus the first 3 quarters of this year, we just have a little bit more activity this year than last year in terms of the number of financings, but almost 2 billion more in terms of dollars raised outside the US. And looking at the series A through D, we see a little bit of a difference from what we saw in the US, where we saw a tiny pullback right now with Series A, and on par with Series D. There really isn't a big jump, but a big jump in Series C. So that's on the number of financings as well as in terms of the dollars raised. And outside the US, these are the top 20 companies that were able to raise money. Almost all of them are above 100 million. You have 3 at the bottom there that are just below 100 million. But outside the US, even though I said dollar-wise, it was really the European venture capital that was going to push higher. If you look at this list of the top companies in terms of dollars raised, you see China on the far right, the country column here. China dominates this, and most of them are in oncology. And oncology is dominant. It's only 3 on the list here are not oncology, one of which is in the COVID space, the Eli Lilly antibody that AbCellera generated. And if it's not oncology, it's a China company. So that's dominating that top 20 list. But overall, the dollar-wise charts are showing it's actually Europeans. Now, if you dig down a little bit deeper, you look at some of the names. CureVac here with the vaccine, they just initiated another trial in Panama. That's the largest, 600 million. That's going to drive those numbers up when you're looking at a max of about 2.7 billion. A round like that will push those numbers up substantially. Okay, so I wanted to give you a snapshot of what it looks like on our interactive chart. So if you're interested in more deep dives on venture capital, you can go to this website. We have different modules, but this is one of them where you can click on neurology. If you're interested in neurology rounds and you're looking at what's been happening in Europe, for phase 2 companies. You can look at the trends and get the average rounds and total rounds for whatever series you're interested to look at. So I urge you to go and get more data there, and we will be updating that hopefully on a quarterly basis next year. But the next update will be the early part of next year for the full 2020 data. Okay, so I'll pause there for the discussion and leave you with these the takeaways here.
Great. Dave, you and Chad do great work. This has really been
Thanks.
helpful. I wanted to maybe hone in on, I guess, two key things. One is this phenomenon around Series A and what we're really seeing here. I guess I'd like to see if we could get more understanding, why less in Series A now? And if we have any insights there, that would be the first piece. And then the second piece for maybe, Marcy and Stacy would be, what advice would you give a company in a Series A? How should they be feeling about this, right? Because basically what we're saying is, you got to get public, right? But companies can't get public if they don't have the foundational investor base. And so how do we get them there? I guess is the question. So maybe Dave, you could start with anything insights there, and then we can hear from Marcy and Stacy.
Well, I think we kind of continue the discussion from where we were with the IPOs, and that is that there is a push to go public because there's a lot of activity on the public side right now. And in the data set, we have 3 companies that within a year went from Series A to IPO. And I don't think that's ever happened in the past. So it would be interesting to hear about why there is such a rush to go public when Series A, just pulling everyone together for the first time to get that syndicate together to set up the earliest of studies to be going public. Is that really the best way forward for most companies?
Stacy, what do you think?
So, it's not necessarily the best thing for the company, but it is the best in management to have to take on all the operations of becoming a public company in such a short period of time, which there are quite a bit, both in terms of extra financial obligations as well as auditing and all the things that a public company has to do that a private company doesn't. But what I think investors see is that the cost of capital is much lower in the public markets than on the private side. And these companies are money burning machines. These companies that are raising these monster Series A's, they're not starting out as these small, scrappy startups that have 2 or 3 employees and building up. They're starting out with big teams, really having budgets that they're going to be burning capital very quickly. And it's a much more viable program if you can get public relatively quickly when you want to burn through $100 million in a year or 2 years. And that's what you're seeing with these big platform companies with these very ambitious dreams. In addition, the investors who are investing early see that their valuations can increase and be validated much more in the current public company environment than they necessarily could be in the private market. So there are a lot of reasons and a lot of trends why people move in this direction. Obviously, if the public markets shut down, everybody's going to change their plans and actually change the way they do these private financings, because I would say that the majority of private financings now assume that you can go public in the not too distant future as long as you get the right investors and have the right management team.
So any sort of, advice for these companies, right? In terms of, I think you're right, because we've seen this before. This movie has been played before. I've worked with some of them, very early stage preclinical companies. All of a sudden they're public and now they're reporting. It's a challenging situation. So Marcy, any thoughts there?
Well, my first thought was, I've wondered if obviously the circumstances of our current environments and future volatility that may lay ahead isn't one of the drivers for the gold rush, right? To get everyone out while there's a window, because that's one of the number one things bankers tell companies, right? You raise money when you can, not when you have to. And if there's an opening, if there's a window, get out and do it. I think for early companies, what's beautiful about being early, especially if you're not only new but also early in the raise process, is you're more of a story stock and less one with a history that you either have to rationalize or a clinical study that you have to speak to data on. But you can tell this great story about what it is your technology is about, where you want to take it, and you can really create some enthusiasm around what it is you're doing. And so when you combine an enthusiastic marketplace with solid enthusiastic stories, I think that's sort of the area that we sit right now. And I think there's different perspectives on what's going to happen in the next few months, but again, I do think that there's a potential for volatility there that may be driving some activity that otherwise may not be taking place. That in combination with COVID, not knowing what's going to happen there.
What about in China, Dave? You showed some interesting data. It seems like there's still quite a bit of things going on in China. In fact, we recently launched a new co out of Perceptive for their first China-based therapeutics company called Lian Bio, which is an exciting story. But why do you think we're seeing less? I mean, is the political environment creating that? What are your thoughts? And Stacy, if you have thoughts around that as well.
Yeah, I think with China, it's not down much. It's probably going to be on par with where we've been over the last couple of years. So even if the year were to stop right now, we'd still have a very strong year. But I think that the China story is two things. One, it's more sophisticated investors that are looking to expand platforms within China, and there's a lot of expertise there. So we continue to see the venture firms that are there, and some of the European and US firms that have arms and venture arms in China itself, so they're able to invest as well and co-invest. So that's on well, but there's also the investor base in China that's looking to invest in Europe and the US. So some of the bump that we get in the Western countries is actually coming from some of the support from the venture money coming out of China and looking abroad, because they're looking at opportunities across the board. We also see companies that are either in the US or in Europe that are being set up to go after diseases that are more prevalent in China and not as prevalent in the West. And so there are entire companies working on specific indications and receiving financing from both sides, US, Europe, and China investors. So that's been a trend, is to look at the unmet need within China itself. And so you're seeing that in these smaller Chinese companies that are being started, but also even in companies in Europe and the US to an extent. So it's broad, and I don't think it's going to be down. When you pull the China venture out of that Asia chart that I showed you, it's probably going to be on par with the last 2 years.
Great. Before we move into M&A, in the interest of time, we have about 10 minutes, so we should move to the next section. But David, are you and Chad covering, in terms of on the VC side, which funds are doing the majority of deals? Do you have a sense there? Is it sort of the likely suspects?
Often it's the likely suspects, although I will say there was a change either last year or the year before, where we saw a lot of investors that we have never seen in biotech before. And so a lot of these were in those later stage rounds where there may have been a clear path to an IPO, but we have seen an uptick in non-traditional investors. You don't see that, however, as much at the Series A level. That tends to be the corporate venture arms working with those early stage investors, and there's still a very small pool of those investors. And I think that's why you have a ceiling of how many Series A rounds you actually get in the United States, which is traditionally been under 100 or so firms.
Agreed. We could talk about this for a lot longer. There's a lot of paths to go down. Why don't we shift to the M&A? There is a question in the chat box. Are there written materials available to download?
There will be for after this session. For those that register, the slides here are going to be sent to the registrants of the event on October 13th.
Oh, great. Okay, perfect. So back to you, M&A and licensing.
Okay. So here the way we look at the M&A is a little bit different than other folks look at it, because we remove all those big companies, because one mega deal can throw off all the numbers. And we break it down R&D companies versus market stage companies. Those are companies that have just had an approval and looking to go commercial, still under $1 billion in sales. And then with respect to licensing, we only look at R&D stage assets for drugs. We don't look at marketing rights for existing products, things like that. And these are these sources here on the right. So for the R&D stage acquisitions, what we have here are the 10 years before 2020, and we tend to label the outliers as 5 billion and above. And in 2018, we had 3 of those. You can see here, gene therapy to cancer plays. And last year was the medicines company, Novartis, purchasing the medicines company for their cardiovascular RNAi molecule. And you can see at the bottom here the number of deals. So really, it's been very consistent throughout the decade. In 2020, this is where we are as of September 16th. We've had 20 of these R&D acquisitions. So it looks like it's going to be another average year. Maybe we get to 30. And we have one outlier, and that is Johnson & Johnson's acquisition of Momenta. And that is a rare autoimmune play. So it kind of goes with this theme where you have, in this case, late stage asset, but in an autoimmune or oncology or rare disease. The next 2 runners up, 47, just missed our 5 billion cutoff. But here you have immuno-oncology for $4.9 billion, late stage asset, and Principia, Sanofi buying Principia for 3.7 billion. Market stage acquisitions, there aren't as many as you would expect. Right now, well, actually 2019, sorry, is at 7, and we only had 6 in 2018. But here you see those $5 billion outliers tend to make up a pretty big portion of each year's acquisition amount. And we use here the upfront amounts because some of these deals are tied to CVRs, but we don't include that in this chart. The 2 outliers last year were both oncology companies. And 2020, here's where we are right now. It's very, very close with where we ended 2019. So we're at 26 billion total. And had I made this September 1st, it would be a much different bar. It'd be down here with 8. But we had this very large deal, Immunomedics, being acquired by Gilead, and that is on par with the record that we had with Pharmacyclics at $21 billion for that acquisition. So that really changed the numbers for the market stage acquisitions. And the next 2 on the list are the Aimmune, the peanut allergy company, being bought out by Nestle, which is not a traditional player in the M&A space here, and Alexion moving into cardiovascular with the Portola acquisition. And moving on to the licensing, you can see that data here for the 10 years. 2019 was a record year with 13.2 billion in upfront payments. Now I have other charts that show the biobucks, the potential dollars, and that's also increasing. But I like to look at how much the industry is actually bringing in terms of cash or in terms of equity investments. And so that's really been the trend in the last 2 years, is that we've seen some of these outlier deals that are really structured with a very large equity portion in the upfront. Some of these are split half cash, half equity. Some of them a little bit more on the equity side than on the cash side, but we're talking large numbers here. We hadn't seen this ever before. And here we have, just in the last 2 years, 4 examples on the screen here. Some of them very transformative, like the Gilead Galapagos deal, which incorporates a lot of molecules, a lot of the platform technologies, and late stage assets, but also this BMS Nectar, that's a single immuno-oncology molecule that's being acquired there. So some differences, but I would say access to platform probably going to be the even when you look at sub 1 billion, tends to be the outlier for these large upfront payments. So 2020 so far, we're almost at 180. So we're almost at the level of deals. These are deals that are over $10 million at a minimum than we've seen in 2019. And we had 2 of these large deals so far. And these are all in the last month and a half. So we have Biogen and Denali for 1 billion, and recently Merck signing with Seattle Genetics for 1.6 billion. And here you can also see this blue portion of the bar, which is preclinical. This is going to be a record for the number of preclinical. Most of these deals here are not preclinical, these large outliers. But in terms of a lot of those 10 million plus deals, a lot of that dollar activity for the upfronts is actually on the preclinical side. So it's going to be a record year for that. Okay, and this is my summary slide, so we can talk about deal making as we close out here.
Great, thanks, Dave. Just a quick couple questions. We've seen recently the Illumina bid for Grail before they went public. Given sort of our surround sound focus on venture, IPO, and M&A, out licensing, etc. What do we think of this trend? Before the company was able to get out, we saw this a few years ago happen as well. Thoughts on that, Stacy?
I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge the fact that it's amazing that the big pharma companies have found a way in the pandemic to get comfortable with doing large acquisitions, because in the past they'd send over droves of people to do due diligence, and some of it would be electronic, but there was also a lot to really get to know the physical plant, and especially on the CMC and manufacturing side. The fact that we've seen these large acquisitions happen where it's almost all remote is amazing to me, that they've been able to adapt in that way. The other thing I'd say is it's pretty consistent with past cycles that when there's a very robust public market, there's also a robust M&A market where they come in and realize that these companies aren't going to sit around and be private, and they get more aggressive in making these offers because they realize these companies don't necessarily need them, and they feel the urgency to do something now as opposed to wait till later. And that's usually what tips the scales for a big pharma company, is why now? And these financings have provided that impetus.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, Marcy, with a number of these out licensing deals, and we've seen them over the years, but now you see like the Gilead Galapagos and more that David showed. It's an attractive model, but certainly there are challenges, from the small to big pharma to small biotech, from a number of different things, including communications, right? Because you've out licensed the assets, yet you're a public company, and you still have an obligation to communicate to your shareholders, yet you don't control the information. What do you think the challenges are, and any advice to give? It's certainly a balancing act, and we've seen this in a number of cases ourselves.
Yeah, I think in terms of communicating, transparency is always the rule, right? That particularly when it comes to the internal management of these processes, I think good alliance management internally is really an important process for any company that makes partnership sort of a part of their operational process. Platform companies particularly have, like us, we have many different options and have lots of inbound interest, right, on the new technologies that are frankly cheaper to acquire, even though these are some big numbers, than they are to develop. So when there's the opportunity to partner, you have a partnership sort of program internally, and then you make sure that the alliance management aspect of that is well managed, so that you have a dialogue that's constantly ongoing with the partners that you're working with, so that you're not sort of surprised maybe by anything that might happen, and so that they are also aware of what's going on inside of your organization. And to your point, communicating externally, there can be some things where you have to be more reactive, just simply because your partner or the organization that has placed interest in your company may take an action that is outside of your control. So again, having that open dialogue with those you have an allegiance with, and being able to be responsive to the outside community, I think is really key to the success of those deals as the company that has assets that are being partnered.
Agreed. Stacy, any thoughts? I mean, you've been on many sides, as an investor and also on the BD side of a large company. Any advice that you'd share with companies?
I mean, I agree with everything Marcy said, and communications are always tough. You want to be proactive and you want to get your message out there, but sometimes it's complicated. And I would advise companies to really hire the right folks to help them think through this. I mean, the difference between good communications and bad communications, you can see it, especially in the public company side, all the time, where they just haven't brought in somebody who's sophisticated on the communication side. So the best advice I'd have is to make sure you have the right person in that spot, because it is not a check the box. It actually can really affect the trajectory of your company if you don't have the right communications person.
Dave, any additional thoughts? I know that you'll be sharing sort of the full data set at the upcoming BIF, is that right? So
Yeah, I would just say in closing with all of this data, I've been so impressed that the industry did not skip a beat. And actually the licensing and the M&A, when I had reported on this in early June, things were not looking as spectacular. I thought it would be a big down year, and it's just shot up in the last 3 months. I'm glad I updated all that data because people have been busy on Zoom, and it's going to be a great year. And when we look at the totals and look back when we write our final report, so that's good. We're going to talk more about the venture capital, specifically doing a deeper dive on October 13th at this upcoming BioInvestor event. And I encourage everyone to show up. We have over 270 investors signed up, venture capital, hedge funds, some angel investors, et cetera, and 350 companies, both public and private company. Yeah. Actually, it's 350 executives from those companies. So some companies send more than one person. But if you're looking for 3 days of partnering, this is where to be in October. So I encourage everyone to go to this website here and register.
terrific. Thanks so much. I enjoyed the panel today and our discussion. I think we could go for a few more hours, but in the interest of time, we must close off. I appreciate everyone joining us today. Again, we know your time's valuable and there's a lot of places to put your time. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Are we off?